He must have stacked these logs and not had a roof on it for a little while because these are actually graying a little bit.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take long, you know, like 3 months.
The internet said Johnny Jett was dead. An obituary spread. Fans mourned. Tribute posts went up. People who had watched this quiet, ponytailed builder work heavy machinery across 18 seasons of Barnwood Builders were devastated. Then the truth came out. And the truth was far more interesting than any rumor. Johnny Jett was not just alive. Johnny Jett had been living one of the most quietly extraordinary lives in American television history, decades before a single camera ever pointed in his direction. A Vietnam combat veteran, a 25-year public servant, a self-taught folk artist, a man who was almost done with cabin restoration entirely when one unexpected meeting in Kentucky changed everything. This is the real story of Johnny Jett, the life Johnny Jett never talked about. Johnny Jett was born on April 28, 1949, in Fleming County, Kentucky, into a family rooted deep in rural community service. Jett's father, Eugene "Gene" Jett, spent years as the superintendent of the Fleming County Water Association and also operated Jett Heating and Plumbing. Gene and Jett's mother, Leota, was married for 62 years, a testament to the kind of steadiness that shaped the Jett household. Growing up in a family that maintained the county's water infrastructure was not glamorous work, but it required precision, dedication, and the kind of practical problem-solving that cannot be taught in a classroom. Jett grew up with a brother named William Eugene, known as Billy, and was raised Methodist in a household that placed enormous value on honest labor. The family did not chase recognition. The family showed up and did the work, and that ethic carried directly into every chapter of Johnny Jett's adult life. From a very young age, Jett was drawn to machinery and to old structures. The question of how things were built and whether broken things could be brought back occupied the mind of a 10-year-old who once asked his father if a century-old barn could be taken apart and reassembled. The answer was yes. That single answer planted a seed that would take decades to fully grow. Long before any television network came calling, long before the Barnwood Builders crew ever loaded a truck for a restoration job, the foundations of who Johnny Jett would become were already being laid in Fleming County, Kentucky. But before the builder could build, the young man from Kentucky had to face something far more serious than a crumbling barn. Johnny Jett served in the United States military during the Vietnam War. Vietnam was one of the most divisive and devastating conflicts in American history. Approximately 58,000 American service members lost their lives. The soldiers who returned came home to a country that was deeply divided about the war itself, and many veterans found the transition back to civilian life extraordinarily difficult. The physical danger of combat was followed by the invisible wounds that many carried for the rest of their lives. Jett served and Jett returned. The specifics of Jett's service remain private, in keeping with the deeply personal nature of the man himself. But the experience of serving in Vietnam and surviving left a permanent imprint on the kind of person Jett became. Deliberate, calm, under pressure, uninterested in drama, and deeply grateful for ordinary life. Veterans who came back from Vietnam and rebuilt their lives through honest work and community contribution represent one of the most underappreciated chapters in American history. Jett belongs to that group entirely. Upon returning from the war, Jett found steady employment and stayed in the orbit of the Fleming County region that had shaped the first years of his life. The maintenance skills Jett had absorbed growing up with a father who ran the county water system became professionally useful almost immediately. For the next quarter-century, Jett would apply those skills in one of the most unglamorous but genuinely essential forms of public service imaginable. The 25 years that shaped Johnny Jett. For approximately 25 years, Johnny Jett worked as a maintenance worker for the Fleming County Water Department. Water system maintenance is not the kind of career that generates headlines or fan pages. It is the kind of career that keeps communities functioning. Every pipe that does not burst, every system that runs clean and consistent, represents hours of unglamorous, skilled labor performed by people who almost never receive recognition for it. Jett performed that labor for more than 2 decades. The same patience and mechanical intelligence that would later translate into dismantling 200-year-old log structures with precision and care were being developed and refined across 25 years of systematic, detail-oriented public service. The discipline required to maintain critical infrastructure day after day, in all weather, without the motivation of public attention or applause, is exactly the discipline that makes a great craftsman. Jett was building that discipline the entire time, quietly, in a county that most of America had never heard of. By the early 1990s, Jett had begun losing family members. Both parents passed away during that decade, and the death of his brother Eugene in 1994 hit with particular force. These losses accelerated a decision that had already been forming inside Jett for some time: a move away from the life in Kentucky towards something different in West Virginia. Jett was not running away from grief. Jett was moving towards something that had always called out, even back when a 10-year-old boy first asked his father about a barn that time had forgotten. What Jett found in West Virginia during those years was the beginning of a partnership that would eventually reach millions of people, but almost did not happen at all. Long before Barnwood Builders premiered, before the DIY network, before the Magnolia network, before any production crew or camera equipment appeared on any job site, Johnny Jett was already dismantling and restoring pioneer-era log cabins. In the hills of Kentucky and West Virginia, Jett and close friend Sherman Thompson had built a practice of locating old cabins, carefully taking them apart, salvaging the usable timber, and selling the structures to buyers who wanted authentic, historic wood. This was not a romantic television project. This was hard physical labor in remote locations, often with minimal equipment, driven entirely by a genuine love for the craft and the history embedded in those old logs. Pioneer-era structures built in the 18th and 19th centuries represent something irreplaceable in American architectural history. The timber used in those buildings came from old-growth forests that no longer exist. The hand-cut joinery reflects techniques that most modern builders no longer know. Every cabin that collapses without being documented or salvaged takes a piece of that knowledge, and those materials permanently out of existence. Jett understood this before it was a television concept. Jett and Thompson were doing preservation work that the broader culture had not yet caught up to recognizing as valuable. The appreciation for pioneer craftsmanship that would eventually draw millions of viewers to Barnwood Builders was already alive and active in Johnny Jett's years before the show existed. The work was real. The passion was real. The cameras had not arrived yet. And then came the day in 1996 that almost did not happen, but changed the direction of everything. The career Johnny Jett almost abandoned. In 1996, a former coal miner from West Virginia named Mark Bowe was traveling through the hills of northeastern Kentucky, looking for old log cabins to restore. Locals directed Bowe to a man named Johnny Jett. When Bowe introduced himself and explained that he was getting into the cabin business, Jett gave a response that has since become one of the most famous exchanges in Barnwood Builders history. Jett told Bowe that the timing was interesting because Jett was getting out of the cabin business. This moment is the hinge on which the entire Barnwood Builders story turns. If Bowe had arrived 6 months later, Jett might have walked away from the work entirely. If Jett had not been there that afternoon in Flemingsburg, when a stranger showed up looking for cabins, the television show that would go on to run for 18 seasons might never have had the cast member who became its most beloved figure. Instead, a conversation started. Jett and Thompson agreed to become suppliers for Bowe's West Virginia operation. By the end of that first summer, Jett and Thompson had delivered 100 cabins to Bowe's boneyard. Bowe recognized immediately what Jett brought to the work: the ability to locate structures, assess their condition, understand how to take them apart without destroying what made them valuable, and operate the heavy machinery required to do it efficiently. Jett was not a beginner. Jett was a master of the craft who had spent years learning something most people did not even know existed as a discipline. By 1998, the three men had formalized that partnership into something that would become the backbone of the show. In 1998, Johnny Jett, Sherman Thompson, and Mark Bowe launched a formal business called Antique Cabins and Barns, based in Lewisburg, West Virginia. The company focused on what the three men had already been doing informally: locating, purchasing, dismantling, and preserving pioneer-era barns and log cabins. The business was rooted in genuine historical preservation, not entertainment. Bowe eventually brought a coal mining background and 2 university degrees to the organizational and business side of the operation. Thompson brought years of field experience and a deep knowledge of the regional terrain. Jett brought the machinery skills, the artistic eye, and the patience of a man who had spent 25 years working in maintenance without recognition. For over a decade before any television producer appeared, these three men and a small, rotating crew of craftsmen traveled across the eastern United States, finding structures that most people drove past without noticing. They saw what those structures actually were: irreplaceable artifacts from the earliest chapters of American settlement, built by hand from materials that no longer existed in their original form, and disappearing at a rate that the broader culture had not yet understood was a loss. The idea for Barnwood Builders as a television show originated when a film producer visited Bowe's West Virginia boneyard, was genuinely stunned by what he saw, and recognized that the work being done there was a story worth telling. By 2013, the DIY network agreed. Jett had been building his portion of that story for 15 years before a single episode aired. And when the cameras finally turned on, the man who almost quit the cabin business entirely became the show's most irreplaceable figure. The man who stole the show without trying. Barnwood Builders premiered on November 1st, 2013, on the DIY network. The show followed Mark Bowe and his crew as they traveled across the eastern United States to find, purchase, dismantle, and repurpose antique barns and log cabins. The team included Johnny Jett, Sherman Thompson, Graham Ferguson, and Jim Rose, among others, over the seasons. The format was straightforward: find a structure, assess it, take it apart carefully, salvage the timber, and give the wood new life in modern buildings. What the cameras found when they arrived at a job site with Johnny Jett was something genuinely remarkable to watch. Jett was the oldest member of the cast, born in 1949, already in his mid-60s when filming began. Jett was also frequently the most physically capable person on the site. The machinery skills that Jett had spent decades developing translated directly into spectacular television. Watching Jett operate heavy equipment with the casual precision of someone who had performed these actions hundreds of times, collapsing rafters, pulling metal from roofs, bringing down an entire structure without destroying the timber that needed saving, conveyed a mastery of craft that audiences recognized and responded to immediately. Producer Mark Bowe had, from the beginning, resisted any attempt to add manufactured drama to the show. When initial producers suggested creating conflict between cast members for entertainment value, Bowe refused. The real personalities of the crew were the story. Jett's laid-back humor, evident expertise, and total lack of performance for the camera were exactly what made the show credible. But the qualities that made Jett extraordinary on television were only half of who Johnny Jett actually was. Johnny Jett is also a painter. That fact does not appear prominently in most coverage of Barnwood Builders, which tends to focus on the demolition skills and the heavy machinery. But Jett maintained an active career as a visual artist, running in parallel with the television work, selling paintings through a dedicated website at johnnyjettart.com. The artwork reflected the world Jett lived and worked in. Rustic scenes, Appalachian landscapes, the textures and colors of old wood, worn metal, weathered stone, and the wooded hillsides of the eastern United States, through which Jett had been traveling for decades. The paintings carried the same quality that made Jett compelling on television: complete authenticity without any attempt to impress. This dual identity, craftsman and artist, builder and painter, demolition expert and quiet creator, is the most underreported dimension of who Johnny Jett actually is. Most people who know the name from Barnwood Builders have no idea that the same hands capable of operating heavy machinery well into their 70s were also producing folk art that fans genuinely collected and purchased. The biography published about Jett's life, titled "And Here's God Again: The Johnny Jett Story," described Jett's career and faith as inseparable elements of a life lived with consistent purpose. The title itself reflects Jett's own explanation for the unexpected turns his life has taken, including the unlikely road from Fleming County, Kentucky, to being recognized by strangers in grocery stores across America. And then, without warning, the internet tried to take all of that away from him. The internet declared Johnny Jett dead. In 2021 and 2022, rumors began circulating online that Johnny Jett had died. The source of the confusion was a genuine obituary. A man named Johnny Jett from Texas passed away on May 7, 2022, at the age of 62. The obituary appeared in search results. Fans who searched the name found the death notice, assumed the worst, and the rumor spread rapidly through social media and entertainment forums. Jett's natural privacy made the situation worse. Unlike many reality television personalities who maintain active social media presences, Jett kept a low profile online. The Facebook account associated with Jett's name was primarily managed by family members and used to promote artwork. The absence of a recent, clearly dated post from Jett himself left a vacuum that the death hoax filled quickly. Fans who had watched Jett work across more than a decade of episodes responded with genuine grief. Comment sections filled with tributes. The concern was real because the connection viewers had built with Jett over 18 seasons was real. This was not parasocial attachment to a polished celebrity persona. This was affection for someone who came across on screen as completely, unmistakably genuine. The truth came out through the show's official channels and fan community. The man who had passed away was not the Barnwood Builders cast member. Different state, different age, different life, same name. Johnny Jett from Fleming County, Kentucky, was alive, building, painting, and continuing to show up on set with the same steady presence that had defined 18 seasons of remarkable television. And the picture of where Johnny Jett stands today confirms that the years have done nothing to slow the pace of a man who has never stopped building. As of 2025, Johnny Jett is 75 years old and still active. Barnwood Builders has now aired 18 seasons, having moved from the DIY network to the Magnolia network when the channel relaunched in 2022. The show has filmed over 200 episodes. Bo and the crew have reclaimed more than 500 pioneer-era structures across the eastern United States. Jett has been part of that work from the first episode to the most recent season. Jett lives with his wife Donna, maintaining the quiet private life that has always characterized the man off camera. The level of personal detail Jett shares publicly is minimal by design. This is not evasiveness. It is consistent with who Jett has always been, a man defined entirely by what he does, not by what he says about himself. The net worth attributed to Jett sits around $400, modest by the standards of entertainment, but entirely consistent with a person who spent 25 years in public water system maintenance before television arrived. The wealth Jett has built is the kind that does not appear on financial statements. The respect of longtime colleagues, the genuine affection of millions of viewers, and the knowledge that hundreds of irreplaceable pioneer-era structures still exist because Jett decided to stay in the cabin business in 1996 instead of walking away. And that decision is ultimately what makes the story of Johnny Jett worth telling in full. The story of Johnny Jett is not primarily a story about television. Television was the last chapter in a life that had already been built layer by layer across 5 decades of unglamorous, quietly extraordinary work. a Vietnam veteran who came home and gave 25 years to public infrastructure maintenance, a man who found meaning in taking apart 200-year-old barns and understanding how they were built before anyone else recognized that as preservation, a folk artist who painted Appalachian scenes while the broader culture was paying no attention. Fame arrived in Jett's 60s, not because Jett changed, but because the camera finally found someone who had already become exactly who they were supposed to be. The death hoax spread because people cared deeply about losing that. The relief when the truth emerged was felt by millions of viewers who recognized in Jett something that genuine celebrity culture rarely produces. A person whose value on screen comes entirely from the value of the life lived before the screen arrived. Johnny Jett spent decades doing extraordinary work before the world found out about it. A veteran, a craftsman, a builder, a painter, and a man still showing up at 76 to do what he has always done. The death hoax was wrong. The man is very much alive. If this story gave a fuller picture of who Johnny Jett actually is, leave a comment below. Like this video and subscribe for more untold stories.